So the first presentation is going to be focusing on the limits, on the boundaries of our planet. Well, it's not an easy term to approach. It's not convenient, but it's important to start from there. So to make a diagnosis, to understand what treatment we can give to our planet. So we'll introduce our first guest. We all know him. Luca Mercalli is a climatologist, is a president of the Italian Meteorological Society, founded in 1965, editor of a Nimbus magazine. Well, it takes half an hour to read your bio. He worked for 3 or 4 TV programs, is the author of several books, including Philosophy of the Clouds, and so on and so forth, traveled through time, etc. But above all, in addition to many papers he has written for the press, he has chaired more than 2,000 conferences. This is number 2005. You can take your microphone. So the question I have for you is not so much regarding climate. But Luca, tell us the truth. I think you've found a way to travel through time. So you have a time machine. Well, you're going to talk about the contribution of teleporting to agriculture. Well, this can be done. Maybe the next conference is going to be organized. It's going to be take place here. My teleporting today was Trenitalia, which was on time, oddly enough. So we are happily here to work and to talk about these boundaries, these limits, which is a tricky word to accept today. Tricky because over the past 50 to 60 years, we have given too much of importance to a no-limit world. You see that SUVs that, of course, can climb up steep hills in the snow. There are supermen that have all sorts of performances, physical, erotic performances, and we believe this is reality, but it's not true. That's only fiction. The problem is that we believe in that, or at least we believe in those expectations. Well, the world is full of limits that come from physics. Physics gave us these limits 13.7 billion years ago, when the laws of the universe have been promulgated. So the Earth was created 4.7 billion years ago. And we have 200,000 years. So we are the smallest of the litter. And just like that, we are too childish. And sometimes in what we do when we are supposed to be adults. You can coexist pretty well with limits, but you have to get to know them, to know these limits, to know the science that recorded tremendous progress over the past few years, with no big sacrifices or things to be given up. But we have to be aware of these limits. So give us this awareness. You've got half an hour. So let's talk about climate, because this is a fundamental topic that tells us why, for example, we have to move on to biogas production.
So up until a few years ago, we used oil, coal and gas, and therefore why should we not continue along these lines? Well, my task consists in trying to give you reasons based on climate change and on the environmental crisis to move to different fuels. So the first problem is that beyond climate change, we are in a situation of excessive exploitation of our planet, precisely because we have exceeded the physical limits of productivity of the biosphere and ability to dispose of waste by our planet. Up until the 19th century, there were 1 billion people. With Industrial Revolution, we developed further, moving to 7.7 human beings, which is what we are at the moment. So it's evident that everybody has a right to eat, have a house, have energy at their disposal, being able to purchase goods. And this requires resources and extraction of resources from the mines of the planet, physical mineral mines, but also forests. The sea is also a mine for fishes. And if we overfish, they become depleted. If we cut down tropical forests, they are gone. They are the result of processes that took tens of thousands of years to develop. And sometimes we destroy them in a few days. Another problem is the accumulation of waste. There is a type of waste that did not exist before, and so it's not biodegradable. Think of plastics. It's a recent discovery. It accumulates in the environment, and you know that the oceans are filled with plastics. Fishes eat them, and the result is that in 1970, humanity abandoned environmental sustainability, so we started using more material than nature could produce every year. So not just we were not just using up interest, but we were using up capital, and this has become our lifestyle. So today we are depleting our natural stock. Now we're using more than 1.5 Earths, and that half a Earth more is what we are taking away from the future generations. If we continue along these lines with economic growth as it is being developed today, business as usual, you know what everybody's speaking about, well, growing just for consuming in a limitless manner, well, we will not be able to continue, because in 2050, when the population will have reached 10 billion people, we will need the equivalent of 3 planets. So we are going to make this natural system go bust, and we will pay for this. So today we have a great need for limiting ourselves to precisely the physical limits of this planet. And we can do that in several ways, through technology, and biogas is a proof of this. There were no digesters to produce biogas and electricity without CO2 emission, and if there were such opportunities, they were not very efficient. But today there are such opportunities thanks to technology and research. And of course, there are other systems to produce clean energy. Think about wind power or solar cells, and this helps us stay within the limitations of our planet. So we need to stabilize the world population. This is a taboo, really, but if we are 7.7 billion and we're getting to 10 billion in 2050, we have a problem. So even though we can solve some problems in the current world, we will still continue to try and get to a solution, because those who are being born have the same rights we have, so they will use up more resources and produce more waste unless we take steps. Of course, we need to educate people, and the United Nations are trying to propose to developing countries cultural ways in order not to have 9 or 10 children for each woman, but just 2. So they are better educated, they are better fed, they are not left on the streets, where we will all be better off. But it's very difficult, particularly in countries such as Africa, where families have this patriarchal pattern. And another point is philosophical, really. We have to be aware that on a planet that has finite dimensions, you cannot have an infinite material growth. You can have intangible growth in the case of sectors that can satisfy human needs without necessarily having to own or possess an object that is limited in terms of its life, and that requires materials to develop and produce, etc. So, as Pope Francis said in the encyclical Laudato Si, well, he has underlined all these ethical aspects. So scientists continue to raise alarms, and one of the latest alarms of independent scientists, therefore who do not belong to any specific institutions and which produce reports such as the United Nations, is this second notice that was published in 2017, signed by over 15,000 scientists, but it didn't hit the headlines in any paper. And science is increasingly worried about our future, but we keep on speaking about other topics as if, our house is burning from the roof, and we talk about the color of our wallpaper. The first problem in terms of climate is the increase of CO2 produced by the burning of fossil fuels. So it's not CO2 per se that causes problem, but it is the CO2 that we have released by extracting coal, oil from the earth, some fuels that had been sealed in the ground for millions of years, and they did not participate in the carbon cycle. And then we started extracting these compounds at the beginning of the 19th century, and so this surplus CO2 is absorbed by oceans and the atmosphere. This is what you see in terms of increase of CO2 over time through drilling through core drilling in the ice of the ice caps, and we see that there have been natural cycles in CO2 content, but natural cycles are always below this line, yellow dotted line that you see, so 300 parts per million. This is the maximum. The lowest parts of the chart show you the glaciations, but in between this period, CO2 values get to a maximum of 300 parts per million. So these are called the intermediary periods. And we appeared in Africa around 350 years ago, and we experienced some ice ages, whereas these are interglacial periods. So from an evolutionary standpoint, we managed to survive ice ages, but we're not prepared to survive in a world that is warming up, because over just 150 years we brought CO2 levels over to fossil fuels to exceed 400 parts per million, which is an unheard of thing during the Earth's history. Then, of course, if you go back to 15 million years ago, of course, it was even higher than that, but there were no human beings around. So the world did not look as it looks today, and even continents were not where they are now. There were different animals. So we need to consider that we have imbalanced totally the chemical composition of the atmosphere. And because CO2 is a greenhouse effect gas, together with methane, not burnt methane. So make sure you seal well all the joints in your digester, because every molecule that escapes from pipes has a warming up power which is 20-25 higher than a molecule of CO2. There is little methane, fortunately, whereas there is a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. Anyway, this is the effect of the 400 parts per million, and it is 1 more degree Celsius in the Earth's atmosphere since 850. So the red bars is what the situation is now, also included today, in the sense that we're in February, but we are 2 degrees above average temperatures. And so this is the 10th warmest February in this area, in this geographical area, over the past years. So you see that this curve is moving up, and the warmest years have been the recent 2. So from now on, we are very worried about the increase in mean temperature. It's as if, the planet has got a fever from 37 to 38 degrees. we have to understand how much up this temperature is going to go. If it's going to increase 1.5 degrees, it's still okay. But if it increases at another 4 degrees, you die. So the human body metaphor is applicable to a world that is full of life. So the pole plane in the last summers saw a huge increase in temperatures. They exceeded 40 degrees. The summer of 2003 was the warmest in our history, with 70,000 deaths in Western Europe owing to excessively hot temperatures. So lots of elderly people or sick people died. 20,000 in Italy, 20,000 in France, then also in Spain, Switzerland and Germany. And after 2003, all summers were warmer than the historical average, and they led to a climate which is really tropical in our regions that have already provided us with some unwanted guests, such as the tiger mosquito, an insect that came from Vietnam and that has found the best conditions to reproduce. And so it not just bites us, but it also disseminates 4 tropical diseases that we didn't have before: the West Nile virus, the Zika virus, and the dengue fever, creating a problem that we didn't have in terms of health issues. So a degree more has already eliminated 50% of alpine ice. So glaciers have retreated by kilometers. Ours are very small, of course, but think of Greenland or Alaska or the Andes. These are glaciers which are retreating at a speed that is unprecedented, at least in this in the past few centuries or 1,000 years. This is what the future holds, and there is also that scenario that we can cause with our choices. So the lowest blue line, according to modeling concerning the future climate, if we maintain an economy business as usual, what we have now, we run the risk of having a 5-degree increase in temperature by the end of the century. We would leave our children an unknown planet with terrible consequences in terms of droughts and extreme consequences that are unheard of. We cannot even imagine them. But if we drastically reduce emissions, we can hope we can stay below a 2% increase in temperature, 2 degrees increase in temperature. And this is the obviously wisest way to go, but we're not doing it. But this is our goal, and also the goal of the young people whom I showed you in the first slides, who are making strikes all over the world, and on 15th March are going to organize a world-level strike in favor of climate. We will see how many people will adhere in Europe, in Italy. But it's important that our young people are making their voices heard, because they are those who are going to pay the most severe consequences in this part of the chart, where we are no longer here, but they can no longer eliminate this damage. This is going to be reversible. So the last report by the United Nations IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, established in 1988, so already 30 years ago. It was established precisely to communicate to the world of politics and of the economy what climate change was. And the last report was published in October, and it has got this number. It says, let us stay within a global warming of 1.5 degrees. We have already, had a 1 degree increase. There is just a 0.5 degree that we have. So we should not exceed a fever of 38.5. The highest the fever, the highest the damage. But the thing is, we have to move fast, because the current warming up rate would allow us to reach 1.5 degree in 2040, which is too soon. We should try to have a longer time, at least until 2100. Only if we decarbonize rapidly the world economy can we reduce the slope of this curve, of this line, and bring it to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. It's a really difficult challenge. They are telling us in this report with very, heavy words. In the report, they're saying we need unprecedented efforts in human history. So these words are really worrying. Do you think that we are making an unprecedented effort? Well, we read every day, news that are totally relevant concerning what our future is, whereas important topics never appear in the political debate, in information, in what you talk about over your coffee. We look at a wallpaper while the roof of our house is burning and we should call the fire brigade. In this data, we see what half a degree can already change. Between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius, all processes, extreme events in climate get worse remarkably. You get here a list of what may happen, having rainfall, decreasing crop yields, the sea level rises, we have coral bleaching. So it's wise to keep this fever under control because this allows us to reduce climate-related risk. And Italy is particularly exposed because if we do not do anything, 5 degrees more at planet level means 8 more degrees in Italian summers. And we will get to a scenario which is like Pakistan today, where normally in the summer the temperature is 50 degrees, but in the Po Plain the maximum has been recorded in Forlì on 4th August 2017. There were 43 degrees. I'm not talking about, figures that are so far-fetched, because between 43 and 50 there are just 7 degrees in terms of difference. So over the next few years, the frequency of these terribly hot summer is going to increase. We have also a lot of humidity in the Po Plain that makes these conditions particularly terrible to suffer, and they're also risky for human life and for those who work in the fields. Think about farming, what happens when you are on a field during the summer. And if we got drought then associated to these temperatures, of course, we may end up with the desertification of our fertile and productive Po Plain. The sea level will rise because of temperature and because the ice caps and glaciers would melt. And the contribution of Greenland has the effect of increasing the sea level by over 3 millimeters. They've already risen by 20 centimeters over the past 100 years. We already have a problem. So we might get 1 meter more in sea level at the end of the century. But if we contain this increase within 1.5 degrees, it would still be 50 centimeters, and it's a damage anyway. And this is, caused by the fact that nobody is taking steps. We have known these problems since the 1970s, and they had already been pointed at the end of the 19th century by a chemistry Nobel Prize. He was said that if you use coal, you're going to warm the planet up. So we have to be careful about what happens at the level of climate, because there are some processes that can amplify and accelerate climate change. One of them is represented by permafrost, so the amount of organic material which that is stored in soil which is frozen for most of the year, Siberia and Canada. If summer temperatures increase, says permafrost melts organic matter, ferments, producing methane, and methane goes directly into the atmosphere, and therefore it warms the temperature up 20-25 times more than CO2. So feedback can destabilize the Earth's climate, bringing it into a greenhouse effect valley, which is very dangerous. So this is something that the Earth has known. And I've shown you this in the previous charts. You see here the Earth, it's as if it was rolling over a ridge. So it can fall into this sort of valley, or it can be put back on track. But we have never been on the right-hand side of this slide. So all of a sudden, you may end up falling into this gap, and the situation would become irreversible for tens of thousands of years, and we would condemn, the whole of the future humanity. Do you feel you want to take responsibility? So you have to make sure you bring this bowl back on track. And we can do that thanks to the technologies that allow us to reduce CO2, but we need to do this right away. If we want to keep within the 2 degrees maximum temperature increase, we have to take steps starting from 2020. It seems to me mission impossible considering what the situation is. But every day we lose, every time we lose time, we are going to get into a situation whereby we can never reach our goal. If we start reducing CO2 by 2030, there is no way we can limit this damage to 2 degrees. We will get to the next step, which is 3 degrees, with a huge increase in the intensity of extreme events and their frequency. So if we want to achieve this 2-degree goal, the whole world has to take steps in order to reduce CO2 emissions in all sectors. And while we are getting prepared for extreme events, which we are going to get anyway because of the 2 degrees, and so they're going to happen anyway. So we have to make cities more resilient against flooding, against rising sea levels, against heat waves, which is more evident in urban areas. A city like Milan has got 3 or 4 degrees more than you get in the countryside during the summer months. And the recipe, and I'm going to move on to my conclusions, to give the floor to the next speakers in order to show you what your role can be in the field of carbon sequestration, is burn less fossil fuels and therefore continue promoting renewables, so solar cells, biogas, wind power, hydroelectric power, and the new forms of energy which are still being developed. So we will also draw some energy from tides, from waves. But let us not forget that because it is more difficult to extract renewables from the environment, they are intermittent, at least some. This is not the case with biogas, and this is excellent in terms of providing stability. But at the same time, we have to improve energy efficiency. We waste too much. So in our homes and in our firms, we have to reduce energy waste. So the biogas can do a lot because it associates the production of energy without fossil CO2s to the increase in organic matter in soils, which is a way to store CO2, which we get from photosynthesis, and it stays in the soil, increasing fertility with a lot of benefits in farming. And it is also a form of renewable energy, just as hydroelectric energy is. And this can be also planned out. So in your digester, you can set aside gas when it's too much and you don't need it, in order to use it when the grid requires it, with for instance, benefits, because, of course, when there are clouds and you cannot use solar energy, you can use this other energy. So this is very important in order to create the new utility grids. So we know the UN objectives set out in Agenda 2030, the 17 goals. However, we are not implementing it. Remember that only 11 years are left before 2030. Objective 13 has to do with climate action, clean energy, clean water. So there are all these objectives that have to be reached. So the Secretary General of the United Nations is always calling upon the world to pay attention to these problems, but nobody's listening to him. Antonio Guterres is a Portuguese engineer. He knows what he's talking about. Look at what he says. Climate change is the defining issue of our time. Climate change is moving faster than we are. If we do not change course by 2020, do you remember the curve I showed you? As of next year, with the entry in force of the Paris Agreement, which is very slow and is very bureaucratic, and is not producing very incisive results, we run the risk of losing the opportunity of averting runaway climate change with disastrous consequences for people and all the natural systems that sustain us. So two lines to tell everything that we need to know about our future. So we need to speed up the transition to a greener future. So biogas and other renewable energy sources, the fight against waste. These are the technological goals for the future. But the main thing is that we don't have much time. We cannot waste any more time like an ostrich. We cannot, keep on acting like this. We need to act now. This is what an activist said. She's from Finland. When the report by the United Nations concerning the 1.5 degree increase, she said that, all you need to know about this report is this: act now, idiots. And then Greta Thunberg in Sweden came up. The Scandinavian countries are the most sensitive to climate change, and she is bringing all our young people to react. So I will conclude showing you these two titles, books that you can read if you want. So this was Diagnosis, which does not look so good, but let us try to come up with a good treatment. And if we cannot fully heal our planet Earth from fever, and which cannot be done anymore because no prevention was carried out in the past few years, let us try at least to reduce damage and to give our children and grandchildren a future which is at least acceptable. I'm not saying beautiful or easy, but at least acceptable.